is History. Today we are talking about the 1980s. So we are leaving the 70s. As of yesterday, we talked about the 70s economy and stagflation. Today we're going to talk about the 1980s, which is a super fun decade. I was born in the 1980s. It is known for its music, for its kind of grunge culture, but it's also known for its politics. This is a decade where lots of stuff happens politically. There's a lot of changes around the world in terms of foreign policy and the Cold War. So we're going to spend today and Wednesday, Thursday, kind of talking about the 1980s. So the 80s, we kind of have a complete turnaround. So the 60s and the 70s, I think we can agree it's kind of a chaotic couple of decades between all of the reform movements, between the anti-war movement, between the civil rights movement, everything going on in Vietnam. There is just so much change happening, right? There is change in society, there's change in politics, there are changes around the world. And so by the time we get to the 1980s, like we've seen in the past in American history, Americans kind of reach a point. It's really interesting that, after a season or a couple of years of intense change, they just kind of want to go back to the way things used to be, kind of this idea of going back to normal. And we see this again, this trend happening again in the 1980s. So while the 60s and 70s were a period of change and at times even chaos, and like we saw last time in the 1970s, kind of a decade of economic decline after so many years of wealth and prosperity, that by the time we get to the 1980s, Americans are looking for a change. So the question becomes, what is that change that they're looking for? Well, in the 60s and 70s, we had a string of Democratic presidents that had some more progressive policies. We saw a lot of welfare reform with Kennedy, with LBJ, later with Carter. And so after decades of Democratic politics, in the 1980s, we have this rise or resurgence of republicanism and conservatism. Okay. And this is best exemplified by Ronald Reagan, which I know a lot of you are just dying to learn about Ronald Reagan. It's like that every year. People love Reagan. And we're going to talk about him today. But before Reagan even comes on the scene, we already see Americans kind of retreating in the 1980s back to conservatism. Okay. And conservatism is kind of a loaded word, especially today. It's still very much associated with the Republican Party, but conservatism is more than just being Republican. Conservatism is kind of this idea that we want to keep things traditional. We want to keep a strong sense of law and order. So we want people to kind of know their roles in society, follow those roles, follow the rules, and again, kind of maintain a sense of law and order. So usually, like conservatives, for instance, will push for more power for police departments, stronger laws in order to maintain more order in society. Now, you can imagine that in the 80s, the reason why people, this is appealing to people, why they kind of go back to this, is because the 60s and 70s were, again, to a lot of people, very chaotic and had a lot of change. And so there's this sense in the 80s that we need to go back and have a stronger sense of law, a stronger sense of order in our communities. This is especially appealing in white suburban populations. And you can imagine, again, why. If you look around at the changes that are happening in the 60s and 70s, most of them have to do with people of color. When you guys did, let's see, that 1960s, like you compared and contrast the different reform movements, you probably noticed that a lot of those reform movements were based in minority groups. So you have like Native Americans, for instance. We've talked a lot about African American civil rights. You have the Chicano movement, just lots of different reform movements throughout the 60s and 70s that are focused on bringing more rights to people of color. And so kind of the backlash, the reaction to that in the 80s is that you have white suburban neighborhoods and populations saying, okay, we need to kind of go back to a sense of law and order, a sense of where things used to be, because I kind of feel like this is a little bit too much change for my group. Okay. And so the people that spearhead this tend to be, again, white conservatives that live in the suburbs, but you have this small group. So imagine them as like, these are all the conservatives, and most of them are like white suburban populations. But within that, like the smaller group, sorry, my nails are terrible. That smaller group, we call them neoconservatives, okay? And these neoconservatives, they are the more extreme category of all the conservatives, okay? And they basically believe that the 1960s led to a decline in morality and respect for authority. That when you look at all the reforms and all the changes of the 60s and 70s, that basically overwhelmingly it was just a bad thing. That people don't respect authority anymore, that people aren't moral anymore, that they just kind of do whatever they want. They believe that all of the welfare programs that were passed in the 1960s and 70s, things like food stamps, for instance, and all those welfare programs in LBJ's Great Society, that it's basically just drained the economy. It's made people lazier now that people are just depending on the government for their check or for their food subsidy rather than going out and working hard. They think it actually promotes single family households, like it makes it easier for women to just have a baby and not have a spouse to help them, have a partner working with them, that it promotes actually like sexual promiscuity and single parenthood. So all of these ideas, right, come out of this one group called again the neoconservatives. And so they think that in order to solve the problems of the world, that not or the nation really, that not only do we have to retreat back to conservatism, but we need to make sure that the government is not regulating or stifling economic growth, that taxes are too high. They want to bring an end to the Cold War, and so they're kind of looking at things very broadly and saying, okay, well, everything is kind of a mess. We can blame it on what we did in the 60s and the 70s, but if we fix that, we're also going to fix larger problems in the country, economically, and in the world in the Cold War. So they're kind of a more extreme segment of, again, that larger conservative base. Not all conservatives are neoconservatives, okay? So there's really, there's a lot. I'm oversimplifying. But this conservative wave or movement, there's two really good examples of it throughout the country. Okay, the first one has to do with American Christianity. We call them the religious right. We're going to talk about them first, and then we're going to shift over to politics, and that would be Ronald Reagan and his presidency. Okay, so the first example of this wave of conservatism in the 1980s is the religious right. Now you can imagine if you've been listening to conservative values, especially the neoconservatives, they are kind of reminiscent of what you might hear in Christian circles. This idea that we need to be, moral, and we need to obey the laws that are given to us and not be, overly promiscuous, and we need to make sure that, we're not becoming lazy and that we're working hard. A lot of these are rooted in biblical values. And if we look at the 1970s, you have a decline overall in church membership. Just less people are going to church in the 70s. And so the 80s, according to a lot of historians, is what we call the Third Great Awakening in the United States. Remember, the First Great Awakening was during the colonial period. Second Great Awakening was in the 1830s, 1840s. That's when we had all those reform movements like temperance and all that kind of stuff. A lot of historians believe that the 80s is the Third Great Awakening because you see a revival in church membership and kind of a transformation of American Christianity. This is when the church decides to take on a lot of America's, again, moral decline and tackle political issues that they feel are bringing down the morality of the country, okay? This movement is largely led by a pastor named Jerry Falwell. He believes that there's something called the moral majority in America, that most people in America, the majority of people, they want to go to war against sin. They are very pro-life, they're pro-family, and pro-America. Now, this is interesting. The fact that Falwell adds on pro-America tells you something about this transformation in American Christianity during the 1980s. This is when we see the Republican Party, which is a political secular party, become more intertwined with American Christianity, okay? That's why today we kind of assume, whether we believe we do or not, kind of subconsciously, that if you are a Christian, you are a member of what? The Republican Party. Now that's changing, I would say, a lot today, especially with youth. Many your age and kind of like the 20s, early 30s. My age group, you do have more Christians who are identifying as Democrats rather than Republicans, but definitely like 40s and up, my parents' generation, the vast majority of Christians, they vote Republican. Why is that? It's because of the 1980s, we see this intertwining, again, between the Republican Party and Christianity because they kind of align their values similarly. What become Republican policies or Republican, platform issues also are issues for the American church in the 1980s. So, for examples, a couple examples of these issues: prayer in schools. You have Republicans who are trying to bring back prayers in school, and then you have Christians that are backing those Republican policies. Divorce rates, trying to bring down divorce rates. Gay marriage becomes a major contested issue in the 1980s. Remember the LGBTQ movement in the 1970s? You have that community getting more rights. There's a backlash in the 80s that's led by Republicans in Congress, but also the American church to try to get rid of some of those rights and make sure that gay marriage doesn't become allowed in the United States. So again, we see kind of the intertwining of the Republican Party and what they hold to be, important issues along with American Christianity. The same issues would apply to them. Both groups, Christianity, American churches, as well as the Republican Party, they're seeking largely to protect the family unit. Remember in the 1950s, we talked about how important the American family is to, just to people and to different institutions, and how in the 50s we believed that everything starts with the family. And if you could perfect the family, then you could perfect society as they kind of go out into their communities and that influence spreads. That idea is still very much true in the 1980s. Again, the focus is on the family. If we can perfect the family, then we can perfect the country and kind of stop this moral decline that's been happening throughout the 60s and 70s. This is 1973. This is when we have the infamous Roe v. Wade case that legalizes abortion. So the 1980s, in order, again, to protect the family, protect the unborn, this is when we get the beginning of the pro-life movement that we have today. So Roe v. Wade was 1973, but the 80s is that backlash against the legalization of abortion and the rise of the pro-life movement. You also have a piece of legislation. It's called the Equal Rights Amendment. It was meant to give more rights to women in terms of like equal pay, things like that. The Republican Party and largely the American church, they come out against the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1980s. It never passes because they believe that it devalues the role of the wife and mother and puts too much emphasis on outside work for women. So again, the religious right is the first example of this rise of conservatism and the intertwining of it with Republican values and Republican issues, okay? And so then the second best example of the rise of conservatism is Ronald Reagan. Now, every year, I always have at least one kid who asks, when are we, like first day of school, when are we going to talk about Ronald Reagan? Are we going to talk about Ronald Reagan? I'm pretty sure this year it was Nick Barton. Was it you, Mr. Barton? There's always one. Ronald Reagan just like, people love him. Like he's very polarizing. Either people absolutely hate him and think he ruined America, or people absolutely love him. My dad is one of them. Just loves Ronald Reagan. Like I think my dad has like 3 pictures of Reagan in his garage. Just loves him. Ronald Reagan, he started his career actually as an actor, California. He was the head of the Screen Actors Guild. They're the one, I think, who does all the Oscars, stuff like that. He was an actor, and then he kind of went into the private sector. He left acting in the 50s. He became the spokesman for GE, General Electric, really big company. And here he learned a lot about capitalism. Okay, he was a kind of a leader, a spokesman in a really big company. He learned a lot about economics while in this role. In the 60s, he makes his jump to politics. 1966, he becomes the governor of California. 1980, he's elected president. Okay, who elects him? Conservatives. Neoconservatives, a coalition of people basically who live in the suburbs, so a lot of white suburbanites. You also have some anti-government crusaders in there. A lot of libertarians kind of unite with Republicans to elect Ronald Reagan. The Christian right comes out and endorses him. So American churches, people like Jerry Falwell, people who are in the middle of that religious right movement, they come out and they back Reagan hardcore. Why do people love him? Well, he is incredibly optimistic. I mean, it's hard to listen to a Reagan speech and not feel super patriotic and just want to get out your American flag and stick it in the ground. He is really optimistic. He's very bold. He's very, very loyal to his base. So the people who elected him, that coalition of white suburbanites, libertarians, the Christian right, he works on their behalf. He makes a lot of promises to them, and he keeps those promises to them. So within those circles, he's very popular. he does believe that, if you listen to his speeches, he really, again, he's optimistic, but he believes that America is the beacon of light and the keeper of liberty throughout the world. That just like sends chills down your spine, doesn't it? The beacon and keeper of liberty throughout the world, which means that he wants America to be the best example of liberty that it can be and continue to spread liberty throughout the world. And that idea, that kind of drive that he has, is going to make him really influential in the Cold War and bringing it largely to an end. Okay. What Reagan is probably best known for, though, is his economic policy. Okay. Remember, he is a conservative, he's a Republican, so he holds Republican economic values. He believes that taxes have been way too high throughout the 60s and 70s. So he reduces taxes. He thinks it's an infringement on people's liberty, that people should be able to keep the money that they make. So he reduces the top tax on Americans from 70% of their income to 50% of their income. He also asks Congress to pass something called the Tax Reform Act, which brings the tax on wealthiest Americans down to 28% of their income. So people are keeping a lot more of their money. And the idea is, and this is true of any Republican president that cuts taxes, it's not just Reagan, that if you cut taxes, right, you're going to inspire Americans to actually work harder for you because they see more in their paycheck, right? Like, how deflating is it when you get your paycheck and you realize how much is taken out in taxes? Reagan thinks that makes people not want to work. But if we give them more money in their paycheck, then they're going to want to work harder for you. Okay. Now, the result of this, even though there is some valid points to that argument, that there is a lot more income inequality. By the mid-1990s, the richest 1% owns 40% of the nation's wealth. Okay. So this, reducing taxes, kind of a double-edged sword. Yes, it does give people more money in their pockets, and in some cases, it does cause people to want to work harder for that money, work more hours. But on the other side of this, it does kind of increase wealth inequality because the tax cuts aren't necessarily the same for every single group in America. Okay. Reagan is also known for, probably best known for, this idea called supply side economics, which we've talked about before. Remember in the 1920s when we talked about cutting taxes on businesses and then that trickle down effect, right? Trickle down economics, where if you cut taxes on the rich or on business owners, they're going to reinvest that money for their workers in their business. They're going to hire more, give bonuses, wage increases, all that stuff. Reagan brings back that idea, but he's largely kind of like, when we remember this idea of trickle-down economics, we really attribute it to Reagan, even though other presidents had done it before, like in the 1920s. He basically, he does this so much that we don't even call it trickle-down economics anymore. We call it Reaganomics, right? And so you might have heard that term before. Reaganomics refers to this idea of supply side or trickle-down economics, cutting taxes for business owners, hoping that they will reinvest it or it will trickle down into the pockets of their employees. Okay. He also kind of weakens unions with his economic policies. There's this one case where a bunch of air traffic controllers who are employed by the government, they go on strike. And so Reagan, rather than negotiate with them, he just fires all of them. And that it was really startling. And it kind of set this precedent for other businesses to do the same. So we see in the 80s that businesses, like CEOs and people who are in control of these businesses, they tend to have more power because the unions have been weakened. Okay, so that's his economic policy, and again, really controversial. Some people love it, some people absolutely hate it. It just depends on where you fall on Reagan and conservative economic policy. His foreign policy is a whole nother story. This is probably the more controversial part of his presidency. My dad downplays this, for instance. In the 1980s, there's a civil war in Nicaragua, okay? And in 1984, the United States Congress basically says, listen, we're not going to get involved in what's going on in Nicaragua. We're not going to take sides. We're not going to aid the rebel group, which was known as the Contras, okay? So America basically takes a stance. We are staying out of whatever is going on down there in Nicaragua, okay? Now, Reagan kind of has some other ideas. 1985, so a year after Congress passes this ban on military aid to Nicaragua, he secretly authorizes the sale of weapons to Iran, okay? At this time, Iran was holding a bunch of Americans hostage, and had been an ongoing situation. We're trying to negotiate the release of our hostages. And basically, Iran makes this deal with Reagan and says, listen, if you give us weapons, we'll give you your hostages back. and it's successful. Reagan's a hero. Those hostages are released from Iran, but we secretly are selling Iran weapons for that exchange. That was the deal, okay? Now, the CIA director at this time and the lieutenant colonel of the National Security Council, they're using the profits, basically, from this Iran deal, all the weapons that we're selling Iran, to buy military supplies for the Contras, okay? So we're taking money from Iran as we're selling them weapons, and then using that money to help the Contras down in Nicaragua. So none of this money, it's kind of like an under the table deal. None of this money is being recorded or held accountable by the Congress, right? Who has said, nope, we're not going to give them money. Everything is being done under the table, okay? And so basically in 1987, this scheme is exposed. There are all of these congressional hearings. It's a really big deal. Members of Congress, they start implicating or arresting, convicting people in the Reagan administration of perjury, of lying under oath, destroying government documents. Now, Reagan has always did say, I didn't know anything about this. This was something that my CIA director was doing, my lieutenant colonel was doing, but I didn't know anything personally about it. Maybe yes, maybe no. I mean, I guess we'll never know unless there's some document that comes out. But it did kind of call into question how much control over his administration he had, right? I mean, worst case scenario, he knew about it and then lied, and that's terrible. But even like the best alternative that he didn't know about it, like let's say he's telling the truth, even that kind of calls into question, like how much control do you have over your people if they're doing these illegal activities and lying under oath and you didn't even know, right? So either way, worst case, best case scenario, either side, Reagan doesn't come out looking great, right? And so this is kind of, again, one of his low points in terms of his legacy as president. But again, high point, if we're looking again at foreign policy, Reagan is kind of largely attributed the end of the Cold War. A lot of people believe that Reagan is the one who kind of brought the Cold War to an end, or at least started the process of that, okay? Different people will think different things about this, as always historians like to argue. But Reagan definitely played a big role, and that's because he is really aggressive. As soon as he comes in, remember, America is a beacon of light and of liberty, and so he wants to bring an end to the Cold War, and he wants to bring liberty to Eastern Europe, okay? So he starts something, and people are fascinated by this. They call it Star Wars. It's Strategic Defense Initiative, and it's basically the space program or space system that was meant to intercept a nuclear missile and destroy it in air, okay? And so, again, this is kind of, people like to talk about it, people like the Star Wars reference. It's a fun thing to research, but it kind of shows, it represents that he is taking a much more aggressive policy. Here we have a president, again, developing new technology in order to win the Cold War, much like we saw with the arms race when we're developing all those weapons in the 1950s, okay? So in a lot of ways, Reagan, he resumes the arms race, and he starts encouraging Europe to even stockpile nuclear-range missiles because they've largely recovered from World War II. So we're like, hey, you should get on board at this point since you've recovered and start making some nuclear missiles to protect yourself as well, okay? He spends a lot of money, Reagan spends a lot of money on military defense. He wants to combat communism in Africa, in Latin America. So again, just kind of overall, when we're looking at the Cold War and all the ups and downs in terms of intensifying and then de-escalating, Reagan is a big part of kind of ramping things up, but so much so that in reality, it does kind of bring it to an end. It kind of brings it to a head. During his second term, because Reagan serves 2 terms, 8 years, he kind of softens a little bit, and a lot of the reason for that is because the Soviet Union gets a new premier. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he is probably one of the top 10, top 20 most influential figures in the 20th century. He's a reformer, so he introduces a lot of reforms in the Soviet Union. He is a very different type of dictator. He wants to actually bring in a little bit of capitalism to the Soviet Union, and Reagan really preys on that. So you have Mikhail Gorbachev, who's kind of a more passive figure, a reformer over in the Soviet Union, but you have Reagan over here who's very aggressive, okay? So Reagan starts kind of putting pressure on Gorbachev to make more and more changes, and this pressure is what's ultimately going to cause Gorbachev to cave on a lot of issues and bring an end to the Cold War. It's much more complex than that. which is why I'm going to give you another lecture later this week on the end of the Cold War, like how it actually comes to an end and the forces that come into play. But that's the role that Reagan plays. He kind of puts pressure on Gorbachev. So 1985, 1987, there's some arms reduction agreements between the two powers. Again, trying to once again bring down the number of weapons that we have between the two of us. 1987, this is Reagan's infamous speech, which I think I'm having you watch a little bit of it today, where he asks Gorbachev to tear down that wall, where he says, like, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. That's 1987. And then in 1988, Reagan goes and visits Moscow, which is a big deal when these two people meet face to face, people who are enemies, and issue all these threats, back and forth from across the ocean. To have them meet in person like that is a big deal and a big step towards the end of the Cold War and kind of building friendship and cooperation between the two powers. Okay, so a lot happens in the 1980s. Today we just kind of covered what's happening socially and politically and a little bit economically, but we're going to finish this off talking about the 80s, like I said, next time when we talk about the end of the Cold War, and I give you the specific events that actually drove it to its final stand. So it's, again, exciting week as we kind of finish up the curriculum. I hope you guys are doing well. I miss you. Wash your hands, get out and enjoy the beautiful weather. See you soon.